It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, we're up to our pits in Strange Invaders. Now, I want to take you back to the early to mid-'80s. I was a little lad who often watched TV and movies. No surprise there, huh? But a couple of movies that would come on from time to time between, say, 1984 and maybe 1987 or so, that I would catch often, and they both had to do with alien invasions and both kind of scared the dickens out of me. Well, the latter of the two films, the one that came out a little bit later, was Invaders from Mars, and that's the 1986 remake of the one from 1953 that I've covered previously on the show. That 1986 remake was directed by Tobe Hooper of Texas Chainsaw Massacre fame. Now, still, it scared me a lot because I think because of the main character of the movie was a little kid who knew something was wrong and had to try to navigate how to get help or solve for what was wrong and so forth. But the other movie that I caught that actually scared me quite a bit as a kid is this week's featured movie, Strange Invaders. Now, both had something that is very 50s in nature, making both movies incredible homages to the sci-fi films of that earlier era. They featured people being changed or replaced. Sure, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is by far and away the most famous example of that trope, but that one didn't quite get to me like these two 80s films. For Strange Invaders, I was consistently reminded of this peculiar little movie that started in the late 50s and then came to present day of that time, which would have been 83, and had these people being turned into these glowing blue orbs that floated around. It's by far and away the most memorable thing about this movie, and it stuck with me for decades. Now, what I didn't realize until I got older was all the huge people who were involved with this movie. The star of the movie is Paul Le Mat, who was not only one of the main characters of American Graffiti, but he also was the lead in Puppet Master, a fun little monster movie in its own right. Nancy Allen was in a ton of great films, from The Last Detail to Carrie to Blowout to RoboCop to Out of Sight, and on and on. You've also got Michael Lerner, who is one of the better character actors of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, who just passed away earlier this year. There's Wallace Shawn, another fantastic character actor for many, many, many decades now, too. June Lockhart plays Paul Le Mat's mom in this. Of course, she's best known for being the mom on Lost in Space and in Lassie. Of course, there's Louise Fletcher, one of the greatest film villains in my mind at least, of all time. Of course, she played Nurse Ratched in my favorite film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now, she too just passed away last year. But she too was also in Tobe Hooper's Invaders from Mars. And I think just generally, while she isn't necessarily a quote-unquote villain in this movie, she does have a villain role in Invaders from Mars and in Flowers from the Attic as well. So Fletcher is just one of the all-time villains of my life watching movies, I think. Now, this movie was directed by Michael Laughlin. Now, he actually didn't make that many movies. Most of his credits were from the late 60s and 70s, where he was kind of listed as a producer. As director, he made 1981's Strange Behavior that preceded this movie with most of the same actors and crew. He then made 1985's Mesmerized, starring Jodie Foster and John Lithgow. Laughlin would be one of the many millions of people who died due to the COVID-19 complications, and he was 82 at the time that he passed away, I think in 2021. But co-writing Strange Invaders with Laughlin was Bill Condon. Now, Condon also co-wrote Strange Behavior with Laughlin previously, but Condon would have an interesting first 5 films. He made the 2 Strange films, Behavior and Invaders, and then went on to write and direct Sister Sister, which was a psychological horror thriller with Eric Stoltz and Jennifer Jason Leigh as the leads. Now, that film would not get great reviews, nor would his sequels, FX2, which he wrote, and Candyman Farewell to the Flesh, which he directed. However, he would then go on to have a string of successes. He wrote and directed Gods and Monsters about Frankenstein director James Whale, starring Ian McKellen and Brendan Fraser. That would win Condon the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. He would also write 2002's Chicago, which got him nominated for the same award, but he lost to The Pianist, despite Chicago winning Best Picture. In 2004, he wrote and directed the biopic Kinsey about Indiana University professor, which was played by Liam Neeson, and had a whole bunch of other people in it. He wrote and directed 2006's Dreamgirls that won Best Supporting Actress for Jennifer Hudson. Eddie Murphy got nominated for Best Supporting Actor, and that was a big movie for both of those actors. Condon would then go on to direct the last two Twilight films, which are huge box office successes, as well as the Disney live-action version of Beauty and the Beast in 2017, which was the same year that he also wrote the script for the big box office success, The Greatest Showman. To say Condon is a pretty big deal for the last 40 years in the business would be a little bit of an understatement. Now, Laughlin was the one who had the idea of this movie being set in a Midwestern United States small town where you see a good old-fashioned mothership fly in early on in the movie. From there, he and Condon worked on the script together, kind of in tandem in two halves. The idea was to obviously pay homage to the classic 50s style sci-fi alien invader types of movies. And while the film did not perform particularly well at the box office, like I said, it was something that played a lot on TV. And I think it's something that many people of a certain age would have likely caught on TV, either in its entirety or at least in bits and pieces when they were younger, and either have a fondness for what they remembered, or if they are interested in these types of pastiches of the genre, would likely appreciate the film if they discover it now for the first time. But the movie opens in 1958 Centerville, Illinois. Now, funny story, there used to be a Centerville, Illinois, and it was found along the Mississippi River with Missouri being on the other side. But it eventually was incorporated into the new town of let's make sure I pronounce this correctly, Cahokia Heights. I hope I pronounced that right. If you're from Cahokia Heights, I'm sorry if that's not how it's pronounced. But probably because of all the alien business, they had to kind of shut down the old Centerville and create a new town. But anyway, we see two young lovers making out in a truck when a spaceship flies in and aliens come into the small town to basically begin taking it over. When the teenagers get back into town, they individually discover their houses are empty instead of finding their families there waiting for them. The boy then tries to call someone on the phone when we see the shadow of a hand creeping up behind them, and then he turns to yell at whatever that hand belonged to out of fright. And outside we see a bright light through the house's window. Now, go forward to 1983, we meet Columbia University lecturer Charles Bigelow, played by Paul Le Mat. Now, interestingly, Bigelow is an entomologist, just like Mira Sorvino's character was in last week's movie Mimic. How about that? But Charles is visited by his ex-wife, Margaret, who is dropping off their daughter, Elizabeth, so that she can go to Centerville and attend her mother's funeral. Many days later, Margaret hasn't called, nor can they get in touch with her. Elizabeth is concerned that her mother isn't coming back. Charles leaves Elizabeth with his mother and then goes to Centerville to find out what happened. Charles finds a hotel to stay at and asks the owner about his wife's family. And he does have the same last name as Margaret's maiden name, which is Newman, but doesn't know anything about her. The owner says that he knows all the Newmans in Centerville, which is kind of weird because I wouldn't think there would be that many Newmans in Centerville, but whatever. Paul gets most of the same treatment everywhere he goes. They know nothing about Alma or Margaret Newman, and they aren't particularly friendly to him. Now, interestingly, most of the town is either emptied or very outdated. It's like a throwback to the past. When Charles goes to the church, there's a weird blue light that comes from one of the corners by the altar. But he hears his dog yelping, so he tries to hurry back to the hotel, only to find that his dog is missing. When he tries asking locals about his dog, they ignore him. However, because he seems to be asking too many questions now, his car is destroyed and he's barely able to escape town in another car that he was able to steal from one of the locals. As he drove out of town, he saw something that looked straight up like an alien in human clothing who happens to be able to shoot beams from his hands. Now, back in New York, a bus from Illinois arrives and some aliens in human form check into some hotel rooms. One of the aliens tears off his human disguise and is discovered by the maid, who we only hear screaming before it returns to Charles, who's flown back from Illinois himself. He discovers when he gets home that his apartment has been tossed. He gets the number of a woman from a colleague who works for the government. This is Mrs. Benjamin, played by Louise Fletcher. She tells Charles that no one has supposedly lived in Centerville since 1958. Despite hearing him out, Mrs. Benjamin is not really of any use to him. He stops at the newsstand and sees a tabloid with a picture of the same alien that he saw in Centerville. So he tracks down Betty Walker, played by Nancy Allen, who was the writer of the article. She doesn't believe anything he has to say and thinks that he's just a crank trying to sell the tabloid a story. He learns that Betty made up the entire story and the picture came from an old file sent to them in the mail. Later that night, Betty gets a visit from one of the aliens that came in off the bus. And this lady claims to be an Avon saleswoman, tricks her way into Betty's apartment, and the woman ends up locked in Betty's bathroom and fires a beam at Betty's neighbor who went to check on her. But once the police come, when she discovers the body and then calls, the body has gone missing. Also, the woman that she let into her apartment and was quote unquote locked in the bathroom is also missing. Now, this gets Betty thinking, so she reconnects with Charles again, and they actually strike up a romance. However, they are being followed by some of those visiting aliens from Illinois, and their night is interrupted by the unexpected return of Margaret, who apologizes to Charles and tries to find Elizabeth. Betty leaves and notices that she's being watched. Back inside Charles' apartment, Margaret says that she was sent here and was supposed to see what this world was like, but she decided that she liked the life that she was watching. But now her people want Elizabeth to take her back to their home world. And basically, Charles just needs to hide Elizabeth until 9 p.m. on Sunday night. That would be 25 years exactly to when the aliens first arrived, and that's when they plan on leaving. Betty is chased by the woman who tried to get into her apartment earlier, and Betty actually pulls a gun and shoots her and is quite convinced that they are indeed dealing with aliens as the woman spews green goo from her wound. The pair is then, as they are trying to escape Charles's apartment, they're picked up in a taxi by Mrs. Benjamin. She has known about the whole Centerville thing this whole time. But before Mrs. Benjamin can get Charles and Betty to his mother's, Elizabeth is taken by the aliens. And Charles and Betty slip away from Mrs. Benjamin and catch a train to Illinois. And they find the man who sent the photo to Betty's rag mag, and he's a permanent resident at an Illinois mental institution. He tells them that he had a family. They went on a cross-country trip and stopped in Centerville when they were too tired to continue. He left his family in the same hotel that Charles was at earlier while he went to the church and investigated the strange blue light that Charles also saw by the altar. He witnesses people in lab coats messing around with this glowing blue orb that seemed to be making the sound of a child crying. He's discovered by the people, and they decide to take his family instead. And he witnesses one of his kids being turned into one of the blue orbs, and it cries out to him as the 3 orbs that were his family float away towards the church. Now, this guy's name was Willie. This is Michael Lerner's character. And he stows away with Charles and Betty as they drive to Centerville. And they initially get stopped by Mrs. Benjamin's team of government goons. And she says that this has all been agreed to. These aliens came here 25 years ago, and tonight they plan on leaving as part of the original deal. This has been a whole thing between the aliens and the government, seemingly from the start. Now, Charles pulls a gun and is able to get past the goon squad and gets into town. Willie plans to do some revenge on his own, while Charles and Betty try to retrieve Elizabeth before they put her on the spaceship and leave. Now, Charles and Betty are captured by some of the Centerville locals, and the town is in the basement of the church getting a message from their alien leader, basically congratulating them on getting to the end of their big plan. Now, Charles and Betty are taken to the same place, and the alien leader guy tells Charles that Elizabeth will be traveling a great distance very soon. And as he's saying this to Charles, Betty grabs Elizabeth and takes off with her. And the town chases them down, and Willie tries to help, but the town takes back Elizabeth and turns Willie and Betty into blue orbs. Then the mothership returns, and the town prepares to leave. Each person begins tearing off their human disguises so they can return as they were. And just before the mothership leaves with Charles and Elizabeth, Margaret intervenes and uses her laser finger powers that all the aliens have. That's how they turn them into blue orbs and stuff sometimes. But she's able to shoot some of the other aliens. And Elizabeth also has the same powers and shoots the door of the mothership, which allows her and Charles to escape. As the mothership leaves, the orbs are released from the church, and all the residents of Centerville and anyone else turned into orbs are turned back into their human forms as they were when they were transformed. Even though, this even includes Charles's dog, who was zapped into a blue ball when he was originally went to Centerville earlier in the movie. So let's get to the 3 things I like about Strange Invaders. First, I don't think you can talk about this movie without talking about how much of an homage this movie is to the sci-fi films of the 50s. Remember, this came out after E.T. hit it big in 1982. Every movie that wanted to cash in on that wanted a little ugly but cute alien pal that came down and befriended a little boy. This movie goes back to the small town feel of a movie like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. There's an isolation element, and the locals are still being trapped in the 50s that will also get a little homage in something like Night of the Creeps a few years later. It does a good job of having people look like they are up to no good, like the guy who runs the hotel or the lady who keeps chasing after Nancy Allen. But you also have things that early on happen in the shadows, like when the kid at the beginning was taken and you saw the shadow of the alien hand creeping up behind him. When Charles sees an alien, it's a quick shot that, unless you're paying attention as a viewer, you may also miss it. These are all classic techniques to hold off showing us the monsters for a better moment, which we do get when the aliens come to New York City and the one guy rips his face off in the bathroom. And there's also a lot of soft focus or haze added to this movie too that gives it a nostalgic gaze as well. And I like that sort of thing in these early 80s movies. Second, I love that there's a happy ending to this movie. There is no happy ending to the aforementioned Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Those people are gone. They weren't just replaced with imposters. They were killed in the process. This movie replaces the citizens of Centerville, but they're going to be released in the end. I don't think that there was any intention to believe that the aliens weren't going to return the citizens to their former selves. Sure, the people of Centerville didn't like being taken. No one liked becoming blue orbs, and it seemed as though they had no idea that they were going to be returned to normal, but they weren't killed. Unlike the typical 50s sci-fi movie, also, the government was in on the plot too. They aren't going to be the ones who stop the alien and restore the people. No, they made a deal with the aliens. There was a bit in there from the alien leader who said something about what the plans for the planet were ultimately going to be based on the 25-year research. But if it was going to possibly result in an invasion, I don't think they would have freed the taken people. So I chalked this up to being a happy ending all the way around. The real struggle was personal. Charles married an alien who then gave birth, and it was that woman and the little girl who do all the big stuff to make sure the little girl doesn't get taken away from her father. And on top of that, the mother didn't plan on staying either. She was always planning on leaving. That's kind of an unusual thing to see in a story like this. You would have thought both mother and daughter would have fought to stay behind since Margaret fell in love with Earth during her stay. But no, she was going to leave. She just didn't think it was good for little Elizabeth. Now, lastly, the aliens and what they are doing is really pretty interesting, and this has always stayed with me for the last nearly 40 years since the first time I saw it. First of all, I love that aliens are wearing people suits. They don't transform into people, they wear people. So you have a scene or two of aliens ripping off their human skin to reveal the monster underneath. The aliens are kind of typical alien design, but they are scary looking. They don't seem friendly. At least they didn't look friendly. When you hear the big alien leader talking to his people, he seems kind of friendly, but he doesn't have everybody's best intentions in mind. But because they didn't look friendly and because they were wearing people suits and they ripped that off, that was scary to me as a kid. But the idea of extracting the people's essence, or I guess their souls, and turning them into these blue orbs will never be forgotten. I think that was the thing that scared me the most as a kid, particularly in the scene when Michael Lerner is telling Paul Le Mat and Nancy Allen what happened to his family, and actually seeing an alien attacking a kid who wouldn't have been much older than I was when I first saw this movie, and seeing his body like deflate and like get all gross and everything, and that blue ball that was who he was coming out of him. And that's terrifying, but also really cool at the same time. But worse, the people in the orbs can still understand what's going on. They cry. They see their loved ones. They call out for their loved ones. That's scary. So it's a great little piece that keeps this movie forever memorable to me. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to the Film Seizure Podcast to get both the Film Seizure Show and the Monster Monday Show at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, we conclude the 60s Yokai Monsters trilogy as we take a journey along with ghosts. Until next week, stay spooky.